There is a cultural liberal bias inside the BBC, and that's partly in the nature of a public service broadcaster. So I think the BBC is impartial politically, but it tends to take a generally sort of liberal view of quite a lot of social issues. And I think that's also true of quite a lot of other journalistic areas, so it's not unique. But the BBC needs to be aware of that.
Hi, welcome, Roger. So when we hear the Culture Secretary talking about bias at the BBC, what is your I don't know, your own take on it? Is this a legitimate concern for impartiality at the state broadcaster, or is there a motive here, something more to it? What do you think?
I think at the moment, in all candor, John, there's an election coming up, and there's this urge to get the culture wars going. And this announcement seems to be part of that. And I'm just looking at my screen now at a headline on the GB News website. And I'm kind of in favour of GB News existing, but it says Lucy Fraser hails GB News for balance after warning issued over BBC bias. And that does seem slightly in a world of mirrors. And nobody would seriously argue that GB News is an impartial public broadcaster. It brings something to the journalistic mix, and I'm kind of okay with that. But to put it in the same category of the BBC seems odd. So I think at the moment it's banging a drum for an election, though it is also true that the BBC is an imperfect organisation. It needs to be better in some areas. So in the bigger picture, it is right for culture secretaries to hold the BBC to account. Of course it is.
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of my professional life at the BBC, as of course did you, Roger. And during that time, it was often said, inside as well as from outside, that there was something. Well, it was described as a liberal bias, a cultural liberal bias in the BBC. Was that your view? And if it was your view, what did it mean?
I think there is a cultural liberal bias inside the BBC, and that's partly in the nature of a public service broadcaster. So I think the BBC is impartial politically, but it tends to take a generally sort of liberal view of quite a lot of social issues. And I think that's also true of quite a lot of other journalistic areas, so it's not unique. But the BBC needs to be aware of that, because if you look at something like crime, there are people who say that crime is caused by spending cuts and inadequate policing, and other people say it might be family breakdown or lack of discipline in schools. Both of those are legitimate arguments, and the BBC sometimes defaults a bit in one direction. So I think you've always got to make sure the BBC is looking at the widest possible range of views and keep making it better. But I'm not sure that the examples given by Lucy Fraser today, which were, of course, actually in her Sky News interview, no examples really of BBC bias. It was we use that phrase car crash interview probably a bit too much, but it really was a car crash interview with Kay Burley this morning. And if they are going to come up with arguments about systemic bias, they need to provide some evidence rather than just what Lucy Fraser says in an election year.
Yeah, it's fair to argue, isn't it, Roger, that I know with an election coming or without an election coming, with the future of the BBC licence fee very much open to discussion now. The BBC doesn't just need to be impartial; it needs to be seen to be trying to be impartial, to be bending over to be impartial, or it's going to undermine its own case when it comes to funding, apart from anything else.
Yes, and I mean, John, you and I have just discussed liberal bias. The most common feeling among the public about the BBC is usually that it's pro-government, and that can apply both in a Labour government and a Tory government. So perceptions of bias that Lucy Fraser should be looking at are quite a lot of people think the BBC leans towards the Tory government, and that's compounded by having a chair, Richard Sharp, who is a Tory donor. It's compounded by the fact that Tim Davie was once a candidate for the Conservatives in a local council, by having Robbie Gibb on the board. So, all these things are part of the mix. And I don't think
So
that
was that accusation true at that point?
well, I think that inevitably, I think the reason people think the BBC is biased towards the government sometimes is that when there is a government in power, inevitably its representatives are more on the airwaves. So you are going to get more ministers on the airwaves who are Tories at the moment, or probably later in the year or next year, more Labour people on. And that does fuel accusations of bias. And of course, the other thing for the BBC, and as I say, it's an imperfect organisation, much as I love it, is that the BBC does also get talked about a lot more than anybody else. So the BBC's discussions and debates about bias, including Lucy Fraser's, are much greater than ITV's. So inevitably, some of that is a backwash into the public who then have some of their doubts fueled about the BBC. And that's why some people do like pursuing those culture wars.
Okay, Roger Mosey, good to talk to you, Roger. Thank you.